This is Social Work 207, Social Welfare Policy 1. My name is Jin Kim and I'll be your instructor this semester. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick tip about how to get the most out of these lectures. I think if you print out the PowerPoint slides that I've posted for you on D2L, if you'll print those out ahead of time before accessing these lectures, and then if you follow along and take notes on your slides, I think that's probably the best way to experience these lectures. So if you haven't done so yet, I'll give you a chance to go ahead and print out those slides now. This is the very first lecture of the semester. We're talking about social welfare policy, just a basic introduction to what social welfare policy is. And so the logical place for me to start is with the definition of social welfare policy. And I take you to different sources here. So we're considering the question of what is social welfare policy. First, I take you to Wikipedia. Not a very helpful source. But we'll look at this definition. Students love Wikipedia, so we'll go ahead and take a look at this definition. They say that it's a part of public policy. In other words, it's a branch of public policy. That's a part of the definition that I do like, however, and it has to do with social issues. So that's the latter part of that definition. It's a little bit vague. It just says that it has to do with social issues. So not very helpful for our purposes. It is a branch of public policy, and we'll take that away from this definition here. We go to a more credible source, and that's Harvard University. And Harvard, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, they say that, and mind you, this is a definition of social policy, not necessarily social welfare policy, but they say that it's, once again, it's public policy, or at least a branch of public policy, and they name the very specific areas that indicate or that reflect social issues. And so they give examples here of healthcare, human services, criminal justice, and so forth. And this is a very specific definition of social policy. But for me, when we define social policy, that's still a bit broader. That's generally broader than what we're looking for, although this is very specific in terms of the areas that are covered. The best definition, I think, for our purposes comes from your textbook. That's the Donito textbook. And so she says that social welfare policy, for me, once again, social welfare policy is a bit more narrow than what we consider to be social policy. So in terms of social welfare policy, we're talking about government action or inaction. So what governments choose to do or not to do regarding the income, services, and opportunities that are available to otherwise vulnerable populations. So the important parts of this definition, we're talking about government action or inaction, so there must be government involvement. We're not talking about private sector material, we're talking about government action or inaction, and then we're talking about typically income, services, a different type of benefits that accrue to individuals under the various public programs. And then the most important part, I think, of this definition is whether or not there's some impact, and for me, there should be some direct impact on vulnerable populations. So is there a vulnerable population that's being affected? For example, the aged, the blind, the poor, certainly. And so this will be our definition going forward. So let's look at some examples of some policies, some public policies, and see if they fall within our definition of social welfare policy. So first, we'll look at Social Security. In parentheses, you see there the acronym, the formal name is Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance, and then the acronym OASDI. This is a program for retirees. They're survivors and persons with disabilities who have contributed over their lifetime. They've paid their FICA taxes. And so if we're looking at whether or not this falls within our umbrella definition, certainly we have government action. It's a government-sponsored program. It's a federal, it's a national program, and it's an income support program. So it provides income maintenance or income support. And then if we're asking whether or not this touches on a vulnerable population, certainly in the way of seniors, persons with disabilities, arguably vulnerable populations, so fits nicely, I think, within our definition. So this is in fact covered in our class. Supplemental Security Income, another federal income support or income maintenance program. In other words, it provides income as the main benefit to the beneficiaries. And the populations that are affected, we're talking about aged, blind, and disabled. So certainly falls within our definition of social welfare policy. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF for short. This is the current name given to our welfare program. So once again, we have government action. This is largely administered at the state level, not necessarily federally administered, but we have state government involvement. And then we have income support to poor populations, so another arguably a vulnerable population being affected. And so I think it fits within our definition. And then we have Medicare. This is a health insurance program, our federal health insurance program for seniors and persons with disabilities. So certainly falls within our definition of social welfare policy. We have government action, vulnerable populations, Medicaid, even more so I think in terms of its direct impact on vulnerable populations. This is a health insurance program that requires you to be poor to receive the benefits under the program, and so certainly falls within our definition. And then we have child protective services. This is typically at the state level. This is a program providing treatment and prevention for victims of maltreatment. And so certainly vulnerable populations being affected and thus falls within our definition. More examples here. You could argue these are sort of a bit more in the gray area, but I'll let you know whether or not they fall within our definition. Foreign policy, not covered in this class. So one could possibly argue that foreign policy, it touches on vulnerable populations, but not necessarily direct impact. Foreign policy does not necessarily have to do with vulnerable populations, and so we don't really cover foreign policy in a social welfare policy class. Military policy, once again, maybe you make the argument that it affects vulnerable populations, but not covered in this class. So not that direct effect on vulnerable populations. We're not talking about vulnerable populations necessarily, and so not covered. Environmental policy. Environmental policy is a class that, policy, a type of policy that you'll cover in public policy courses, along with energy policy, but not covered in this class. We're talking about things like emission standards or global warming and such. They may have a direct or indirect effect on vulnerable populations, but not necessarily that direct effect on vulnerable populations, so not covered in this class. The latter two we do cover. Education policy we talk about in your second policy class, in your advanced policy class. And so certainly when you're talking about school policies that have an impact on low-income populations locally, so that's going to have a direct effect on vulnerable populations. So I think a stronger case can be made there in terms of its effect on vulnerable populations, especially in the way of how schools are financed. They're locally financed with property taxes, so I think a stronger case there. In the tax policy, we're not going to cover tax policy broadly, but we will look at tax policy as they affect low-income populations, and more specifically, we'll look at the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's a program, a tax program for the working poor or low-income working populations, and so that impacts low-income populations more directly. So falls a little more nicely within our definition of social welfare policy. Here, we're looking at social welfare policy categories, or different ways to classify all the different social policies that are out there, or organize your thoughts around all the different policies, social policies. And so one way in which we classify all the different social policies is by way of eligibility, how one becomes eligible for the particular policy or program in question. And one classification scheme that we use in this class is in terms of social insurance, whether the program in question is social insurance or public assistance. The litmus test here, or the distinguishing trait in terms of whether a program is considered social insurance or public assistance, is whether or not it's income contingent. That is, do you have to be poor in terms of income and assets to qualify? Now, if you do, that's typically considered public assistance. If there's a contributory mechanism in place where you have to contribute something to get something out of the program, that's going to be more towards social insurance on this dichotomy. Another way we classify all the different social policies is whether or not we have an entitlement program or a non-entitlement program. This is typically among just public assistance programs. Some public assistance programs are entitlement programs and others are non-entitlement. The basic idea here is that if you're found to be eligible under a certain public assistance program, if there's an obligation on the part of government, on the government unit, whether it's the federal unit or the state level, if there's an obligation on the part of that government unit to provide you with benefits or services, then it's considered an entitlement. But if there's no obligation, and typically the way that you can tell is if there's a long wait list, it's probably a non-entitlement program. There's no obligation on the part of the government unit, whether it's the federal government or the state government, to provide you with benefits or assistance under the particular program. So we can classify programs based on eligibility. We can also classify based on the type of service or benefit that's offered. And so some programs provide income maintenance or income support. I gave you some examples before. So we looked at OASDI, Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance. That's the formal name of our Social Security program. It's an income maintenance program. The main benefit being provided under OASDI is income support. And so we can classify based on whether or not the program provides income in the way of the main benefit. And then TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, our welfare system. It's an income support program. The main benefit being provided, once again, is income support or income. Supplemental Security Income, another income support program, another example. Some programs, they're not necessarily providing income as the main benefit, but they provide nutrition assistance. And so we have some examples here of programs providing nutrition assistance to its beneficiaries. We have SNAP, which is the formal name given to our food stamp program or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's the federal name given the federal program that we're talking about there, providing nutrition assistance. Women, infants, and children, another nutrition assistance program for the named populations, women, infants, and children. And then, of course, school lunch falls within this category of providing nutrition assistance to its beneficiaries. Some programs provide health care, or more specifically, health insurance coverage. Our Medicare and Medicaid programs provide health insurance coverage to the beneficiaries, and so we can classify on that basis. And then some programs provide social services, generally speaking. So vocational rehab might be considered one example, or community counseling. Community counseling programs, they provide social services. And then, of course, we have some tax programs. The Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, provides tax assistance or supplemental payments to lower income working populations. And then the fact that your health insurance benefits, your private employment-based health insurance benefits, they go untaxed. That might be, arguably, that might be considered a tax assistance. And then we have the Child Tax Credit Program. We may or may not get to this this semester, but another example of a tax program. So here we're just looking at, well, why do we care about all the different social welfare programs out there? Well, there's, I think the strongest case to be made in terms of why we care about social welfare policies comes from an ethical mandate. So if you look at the Code of Ethics that governs ethics and conduct and values and behaviors of social workers, and this is put out by the National Association of Social Workers, there are various sections that touch on the need to monitor and to keep current with social policies. And I take you to one of the sections, and that's section 5.02a, which says social workers should monitor and evaluate policies. So I don't think you can get any more specific than this particular ethical mandate for social workers to keep current with all the different policies that are out there, and at least the social policies that are out there. And then if you look at the preamble, the introduction to the Code of Ethics says that social workers promote social justice. And so one way I think we promote social justice is in terms of the policies that are passed or maybe not passed, or government action or inaction is what I'm sort of thinking of there, which in turn begs the question of what exactly is social justice. We throw around that term a lot, and so in the next part of this lecture, we'll consider various definitions of social justice.